the self-antigens or the autoantigens start targeting the autoantigens, producing what are known as autoantibodies. Now, these autoantibodies form immune complexes and they get deposited in various organs, causing organ dysfunction. Now, this disease is predominantly targeting women of childbearing age group. Though people of all genders, ethnic groups, ages can be affected, but predominantly this targets women of childbearing age group. So we'll begin with the pathogenesis. So here, what happens is there is a genetic susceptibility. Some individuals have certain variations or certain mutations in the genes that causes such abnormal immune response to normal stimuli. And there are certain environmental factors together which contribute to the development of an abnormal immune response. So here what happens is there are autoantibodies that are formed with complement activation. There are immune complexes which are formed. This goes and triggers an inflammatory response that results in damage to various organs. So finally, chronic inflammation is going to result in organ dysfunction. So systemic lupus erythematosus, as the name suggests, it is systemic. So here what happens is multiple organs are going to be affected and therefore a varied clinical manifestations are seen in this disorder. So basically, there is a genetic susceptibility clubbed with environmental factors that trigger an abnormal immune response. So the abnormal immune response consists of activation of innate immunity. So the innate immune cells, that is your dendritic cells, the macrophages or the monocytes, get triggered either because of the DNA in the immune complexes or the viral DNA or RNA. Now, sometimes there are theories that possibly that there is a viral etiology towards the development of the disease. So it can be the viral DNA like Epstein-Barr virus or the DNA in the immune complexes formed by the autoantibodies that trigger the innate immunity, which is not usually seen in normal individuals. So these are seen in individuals who have certain genetic predisposition. And there is also a lowered activation threshold of the adaptive immune response, that is consisting of the T cells, B cells. So there is an abnormal activation of both the innate as well as the adaptive immune system. And the regulatory cells, that is regulatory T cells, B cells, which is supposed to regulate the inflammatory or the immune response, is ineffective. As well as the immune complexes as well as the apoptotic cells which have to be cleared are not properly cleared. So all of these are the various abnormal immune response because of both environmental as well as genetic susceptibility. So self-antigens, like the antigens which are present in the RNA, Smith antigen, Ru antigen, La antigen, these are certain antigens towards which autoantibodies are produced. So these autoantibodies, they start forming immune complexes. So when these immune complexes get deposited, that results in the inflammatory pathway, the inflammatory process to be triggered. This inflammatory process consists of interleukins, interferons, as well as tumor necrosis factors. So basically, it is an autoimmune disorder. So self-antigens are targeted here, which doesn't usually happen in normal individuals. So there are environmental factors, like for example viruses, or as well as there are genetic factors. So individuals who have certain mutations in their genes, there is an abnormal activation of the innate as well as the adaptive immune response. So some of the genetic factors are seen, such as upregulation of the genes, which are induced by interferons. Interferons are cytokines, and there are genes induced by these interferons, and there is upregulation of such genes in these individuals, in almost 50 to 60% of these individuals with SLE. As well as there is decreased production of cytokines that are responsible to regulate or sustain the regulatory T cells. So that again contributes to an abnormal activation of the immune system. And also there is sustained production of the autoantibodies and immune complexes. The mechanisms to curb the overproduction of the autoantibodies are malfunctioning here. The complement activation happens and there is formation of the immune complexes. So various cytokines and inflammatory mediators are released that results in chronic inflammation. So this chronic inflammation can finally result in irreversible tissue damage, fibrosis, especially involving the kidney, that is the glomeruli, arteries, lungs, as well as other tissues. Basically, it is a multigenic disease. There is no particular gene that is responsible. There are various genes that go malfunctioning here. And it has a HLA association. The HLA association with DRB1 is seen. There are polymorphisms in the innate immune pathway. You don't have to go too much in detail about these. Just remember it is a multigenic disease. So there are various genetic factors that go haywire. Again, female gender. So female gender, either because maybe because of the hormonal effects. So that is female gender is more susceptible for SLE. It has also been found that people who are taking oral contraceptives, estrogen containing oral contraceptives or hormone replacement therapy, have an increased risk of developing SLE. So that might indicate that there is a hormonal risk factor too. And because estradiol is found to bind to the receptors in T and B cells and prolong their lifespan, so that might contribute to the inflammation that is predominantly seen in women, as well as genes on the X chromosomes. Since women have a pair of X chromosomes, genes on X chromosomes can influence SLE, so that can also suggest why women are more susceptible. Similarly, people with XXY karyotype, so males who have the XXY karyotype, known as people with Klinefelter syndrome, also have an increased risk. So again, it is why women are having a higher preponderance, probably because of the hormones as well as X chromosome. Now these were the genetic factors. Now coming on to the environmental factors. Previously I had told the viral viruses like Epstein-Barr virus can contribute. In addition to that, ultraviolet light has been found to cause certain changes in the proteins, making them antigenic. Infections can induce the normal immune responses and make them become an autoimmune response. Epstein-Barr virus, that is also, some of the studies also show that Epstein-Barr virus can trigger this SLE-like response. So you have plethora of causes: infection, hormones, medication. Some of the drugs can cause a drug-like lupus reaction, ultraviolet light. Smoking also can contribute, genetic factors. All of them together, that is the genetic as well as the environmental factors together, causes normal immune response, resulting in autoimmunity or autoantibody production. So these triggers, both adaptive as well as innate immune triggers, result in this autoantibody production, resulting in tissue damage, organ damage in the long run. So there is autoantibodies that you have to remember in SLE. So this is an important topic. So because there are various self-antigens that are being targeted, we have various autoantibodies specific to those. ANA or anti-nuclear antibody it is one of the earliest steps that you do when you think of the possibility of SLE in a patient. In 98% of the individuals, anti-nuclear antibodies are positive. So this is one of the best screening tests. So if you have a high suspicion of SLE and repeated testing shows ANA negative, then it's less likely that the patient is having SLE. Then you have a highly specific antibody, that is anti-dsDNA and anti-Smith antibody. So to pinpoint or to finalize or to make your diagnosis more accurate, this is done. So once ANA becomes positive, you also do the other panel of investigations, other panel of antibodies. So this is together known as extractable nuclear antigens, the ENA blot, under which we have various antibodies. So anti-dsDNA and anti-Smith antibodies are specific for SLE, as well as they can correlate with the disease activity. So higher the titer, more severe would be the disease. Then you have anti-RNC, which is associated with this overlap syndromes, that is rheumatic disorders or immunological disorders which have features of SLE associated with other immunological disorders. That is together known as overlap syndrome. This is anti-ribonucleoprotein, which is not specific for SLE, but it suggests an overlap syndrome. Then you have anti-Rho or anti-SHA antibodies. Here this is found to be associated with Zika syndrome. These people with anti-Rho are found to have neonatal lupus with congenital heart block. That is why this is important. It predisposes to subacute cutaneous lupus, as well as it is associated with a decreased risk of nephritis. Nephritis, which is one of the grave of prognosis, or which is one of the more severe severe manifestations of SLA, which makes it difficult to treat. People with anti-Ro antibodies are found to have a decreased risk for nephritis. Then you have anti-LA antibodies. Anti-La antibodies, SSP antibodies, again associated with a decreased risk for nephritis. Very similar to anti-Ro antibodies. So you check these together, anti-Ro, anti-La, both of them associated with neonatal lupus with congenital heart block and decreased risk for lupus nephritis. Then you have antihistone antibodies, usually associated with drug-induced lupus. Antiphospholipid antibody, again, this is associated with an antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So that shows that is a hypercoagulable state. So this can predispose to clotting, fetal loss, thrombocytopenia, etc. The other antibodies which are seen are anticardiolipin antibody, beta-2 glycoprotein antibody, and DRVTP, DRVBT. These are the antibodies which come under the antiphospholipid syndrome. Then you have anti-erythrocyte antibodies. From this can suggest people having this can have some amount of hemolysis. And antiplatelet antibodies which is associated with thrombocytopenia. Both of these are not very significant tests. So the prevalence, as you can see in this tabular column, most prevalent is ANA. So that is a very sensitive test. Then you have antineuronal antibodies, which is usually associated. So presence of this in the CSF correlates with CNS lupus. If you have a doubt of CNS lupus in a patient, then presence of antineuronal antibodies in the CSF is highly suggestive of CNS lupus. Then you have anti-ribosomal P antibodies, which is associated with depression of psychosis, again pointing to CNS lupus. So remember this tabular column, anti-nuclear antibodies, the ANA test, which is an ideal screening test. Then you have sensitive, more specific tests like anti-DSDN and anti-Smith, which finalizes or makes your diagnosis more accurate. So these are specific investigations, whereas ANA is a more sensitive tool. People who have multiple ANA negative reports less likely to have SLA. Then you have anti-RNP, which suggests a mixed or an overlap syndrome associated with other connective tissue diseases. Then you have anti-Ro or anti-Ro or SSA antibodies, which are associated with neonatal lupus with congenital heart block, lesser likelihood for developing nephritis, similar to that of anti-La antibodies or anti-HSB antibodies. Then you have antihistones associated with drug-induced lupus. Then you remember antiphospholipid associated with the antiphospholipid syndrome. Three important antibodies that are usually tested: cardiolipin, beta-2 glycoprotein, and DRVVP. Then less important anti-erythrocyte and antiplatelet. Then you have to remember neuronal antibody as well as ribosomal P antibodies pointing to CNS lupus. So these are certain antibodies that are tested if you think of a diagnosis of SLE. So the first one will be ANA, the others together is known as the ENA blot. These are the panel of antibodies that are usually tested. If you look at a histopathological picture, what you see are immunoglobulin deposits, T lymphocytes. In the vessels, you see vasculitic features. So here you see, if you take a skin specimen with an individual something known as discoid lupus erythematosus, so various clinical manifestations we'll be discussing in the subsequent slide. So if you think of skin involvement of lupus, you see again inflammation there. In the kidneys, you see what are known as wide loop lesions, again because of certain inflammatory changes. In the vessels, you see vasculitis. So now, after discussing about the pathogenesis, let's discuss on how we'll diagnose this disease. So you require a high degree of clinical fixation in an individual who presents with a variety of organ involvement, especially if it is a woman, predominantly in the childbearing age group. So you have certain classical clinical features and autoantibodies which together contribute to the diagnosis. Together it forms what is known as the SLICC criteria. So this systemic lupus erythematosus international clinical classification, sorry, collaborating clinical criteria. Systemic lupus erythematosus International Collaborating Clinic criteria, which has a high specificity and sensitivity. So this is what we use. This criteria is what we use to diagnose a patient with SLE. This is the criteria. It has both clinical manifestations as well as immunological manifestations. Under clinical manifestations, we have cutaneous skin manifestations, either acute, subacute, or chronic cutaneous lupus erythematosus. Then you have oral ulcers, alopecia, synovitis, renal manifestations, either based on biopsy, based on the protein creat ratio, presence of RBC scar, neurological manifestations, seizures, psychosis. We are already discussed anti-ribosomal P as well as anti-neuronal antibodies are associated with CNS lupus. Then mononeuritis, multiplex, myelitis, peripheral neuropathy or cranial neuropathy, acute confusional state, all of this can come under the neurological manifestations of SLE. Then hemolytic anemia, leukopenia, especially lymphopenia, thrombocytopenia, all of these come under the clinical manifestations. Now, even if none of the above features are present, just renal biopsy suggestive of systemic lupus will be a definite diagnosis of SLE without the presence of any of these features. Now, under the immunological manifestations, presence of AMA, anti-DLCMA, anti-Smith antibodies, anti-phospholipid antibodies, immune serum complement level, or a positive direct home step, such as autoimmune hemolytic anemia. These are the immunological criteria. So, presence of 4 or more criteria, at least one in each of these categories. In each of these two categories, such as SLE. You require 4 or more than 4 criteria, and it should be fulfilling at least one in both of these categories. Not 4 together immunological without any clinical manifestation. At least one should belong to immunological or clinical. Totally 4 or more. This is the Systemic Lupus Erythematosus International Collaborating Clinic criteria. Now coming on to the major clinical manifestations. So I told you that multiple organ systems are targeted. If you look, it can be a mild form to very severe fulminant form, targeting the various important organs. Important to remember is SLE is not it is a chronic disease. So there are the patient has ups and downs. That is, suddenly the disease will disappear. That is, it goes into remission and then again reappears. So there is recurrence and remission. So 85% of the individuals have a continually active disease. So systemic symptoms like fever, arthralgia, myalgia, fatigue are usually present most of the time. If you look into the musculoskeletal manifestations, we have intermittent polyarthritis. So the synovitis comes under the clinical criteria. So usually mild to disabling, involving the joints of the hand, wrist, knee, soft tissue swelling and tenderness. So you should remember to differentiate it from rheumatoid arthritis. Joint deformities are less common compared to rheumatoid arthritis. So this is one characteristically differentiating feature. This is a non-deforming arthritis. So some individuals fulfill criteria for both RA and SLE. RA is also predominantly the joints of the hands. A single joint can be involved. Then you have to think of ischemic necrosis of the bone, especially if it is a patient who has been diagnosed with SLE, you have been giving steroids. And a long-term complication of steroid is development of osteoporosis. So if you have a single joint that has become painful after treatment, then you have to think of ischemic necrosis of the bone, especially the hip bone, the knees, etc. Again, myositis can occur. Now, glucocorticoid therapy itself can cause myopathy, so that has to be differentiated from an active disease. So this is deforming arthritis that can occur. So this is usually a non-erosive type of arthritis, whereas Jacob's arthropathy, here what happens is that it is an erosive arthropathy. There is ulnar deviation of the second to fifth digit. There is ulnar deviation with subluxation of the metacarpophalangeal joints. And this is a complication of long-term use of steroids, avascular necrosis of the femoral head. This is Jacob's arthropathy, again a feature of SLE arthritis. So that sums up the musculoskeletal manifestations. So among musculoskeletal manifestations, remember myopathy, which can be a manifestation of the active disease itself, or can be because of the treatment cycle. Then you think of arthritis. Then among the cutaneous manifestations, we have acute, subacute, or chronic manifestations. Discoid lupus erythematosus is the most common chronic dermatitis manifestation that we see. Lesions are usually circular with slightly raised hyperpigmented edges with an atrophic center where all the dermal appendages they are destroyed. And the lesions are typically seen over the malar area of the face in acute SLA rash. So this is known as a butterfly rash or a malar rash, typically over the cheek as well as the nose. Which is a photosensitive rash. Can also be seen over the ears, the upper part of the neck, the V region, that is the V region of the neck. If there is a worsening of the rash, that shows that there is a flare of the disease. That can indicate a flare of the disease. And again, you have subacute. So you have discoid lupus erythematosus, most common manifestation of chronic lupus. Then you have acute SLA rash of the malar rash, and subacute cutaneous lupus erythematosus. Again, scaly red patches, which is very similar to psoriatic rashes and psoriatic lesions. Then you have to remember that all these lesions are extremely photosensitive. And oral ulcerations are common. So alopecia, oral ulcers, presence of chronic, subacute or acute SLA lesions have to be looked out under the cutaneous manifestation. So this is alopecia. Then you have the discoid lupus erythematosus over the face. This is the acute SLA rash. Sometimes panniculitis can occur, loss of fat, which is also known as lupus profundus. So among cutaneous manifestations, this is the most common. Think of disseminated. So this is the discoid lupus erythematosus lesions that you see. These are the sun-exposed areas that have developed photosensitive erythematous rashes. This is the malar rash and acute SLA. The oral ulcers that you can see. Now, completing the cutaneous manifestations, we look into the renal manifestations. Previously, I mentioned that lupus nephritis is a dreaded complication. People who have anti-SSA as well as anti-SSB antibodies have less likelihood of developing lupus nephritis. So this is one of the most serious manifestations of SLE. It can result in early mortality, high degree of morbidity. So any patient who is suspected to have SLE immediately have to order a urine analysis. Renal biopsy is also recommended if there is a high suspicion of nephritis. So I had already previously mentioned that individuals who have a renal biopsy suspected of SLE, even in the absence of the exact criteria mentioned according to SLICP, can be labeled to have SLE. So this is the International Society of Nephrology and Renal Pathology Society. ISN RPS classification of lupus nephritis. So this is based on the amount or the degree of inflammation that you see in the glomeruli. So class 1, there is minimal mesangial lupus nephritis where the glomeruli appear normal by light microscopy, but there is mesangial immune deficits which are seen only by the immunofluorescence microscopy. That is class 1 where there you have minimal mesangial lupus. Then you have class 2 where there is mesangial proliferative, wherein you see the mesangial immune deficits under light microscopy, and there can be isolated subepithelial or subendothelial immune deficits visualized by immunofluorescence microscopy or by light microscopy, or by electron microscopy. Then you have focal lupus nephritis. So this class 3, class 4 are very important. Focal lupus, where there are focal subendothelial immune deficits. Focal meaning that less than 50% of all the glomeruli, less than or equal to 50% of all the glomeruli are involved. You have, which is further divided into class 3A, where you have active lesions, also known as focal proliferative lupus nephritis. Class 3A state, that is A bar C, where you have active and chronic lesions, that is known as focal proliferative and sclerosing lupus nephritis. And you have class 3C, where you have pure inactive lesions. Chronic inactive lesions with scarring, that is known as focal sclerosing lupus nephritis. That is class 3 focal lupus nephritis, which is divided into focal proliferative lupus nephritis, focal proliferative and sclerosing lupus nephritis, and focal sclerosing lupus nephritis based on the percentage of glomeruli. Here, 50% or less of the glomeruli are involved. Then you have diffuse lupus nephritis, where more than 50% of the glomeruli are involved with subendothelial immune deficit. So here what you see as subendothelial immune deficit. Again, this diffuse can be divided into diffuse segmental, where within the glomeruli, 50% or more of the glomeruli are involved within each glomeruli. Where less than 50 and more than 50, that is diffuse segmental and diffuse global. And each of this can be further classified into A and A, C or A bar C. Diffuse segmental, diffuse global, diffuse segmental proliferative, diffuse segment proliferative and sclerosing, diffuse global proliferative, diffuse global proliferative and sclerosing alone for both diffuse global as well as diffuse segmental. So remember, class 4 alone has an additional classification of global as well as global as well as segmental under diffuse. So diffuse per se is 50% or more of the glomeruli, and within the glomeruli, if 50% or more have segmental lesions or 50% or more have global lesions. Based on that, it is divided into diffuse segmental and diffuse global. And each of this is further classified into A, C or A bar C. Then you have membranous lupus, where you have some epithelial immune deficits, either global or segmental, seen by light microscopy and by immune fluorescence or electron microscopy. Then you have class 6, which is advanced sclerotic, where 90% or more of the glomeruli have irreversible sclerotic changes, where the glomeruli do not have any residual activity. So proliferative form is where you have to urgently treat because it can rapidly progress to ESRD, whereas class 6, almost all the glomeruli are not functioning, so it is already in the end stage. Treatment is not going to much change your prognosis. So here is in class 3 and 4, where reversal is possible with vigorous immunosuppression, is where aggressive treatment is needed. Now, membranous glomerular changes. So this it has better prognosis. So this class 1 and 2 has better prognosis, but 3 and 4 you require vigorous treatment to prevent progression into irreversible damage. Okay, so this is again a summary of what is happening within the glomeruli. Initially, we have minimal mesangial, then you have mesangial proliferative, then you have focal lupus nephritis, then you have diffuse, then you have membranous followed by sclerosing. So initially, you have mesangial deficits, then you have subendothelial deficits which form class 3 and 4, then you have subepithelial deficits which form the membranous or the class 5 lupus. Finally, there results in permanent organ damage. So you have either it can be asymptomatic or minimal systemic symptoms, or there is organ damage, especially most important or most feared complication is lupus nephritis. Any patient who has SLE, you should send a urine analysis, and if there is high suspicion of renal involvement, renal biopsy is of utmost importance. Again, this is the histopathological classification just to revise: minimal mesangial, mesangial proliferative, focal, diffuse, membranous, and sclerosing. Remember, class 3 and class 4 is important where you initiate treatment aggressively. Class 3 is further classified into focal proliferative and sclerosing, and focal sclerosing lupus nephritis, whereas class 4 is further classified into global as well as your segmental, and each of these is further subclassified into proliferative and sclerosing. So 1 and 2, 1, you do not have features on light microscopy, only features under immunofluorescence or electron microscopy. Again, class 2, you have features on light as well as electron microscopy. Basic, some few, there is mesangial proliferation as well as subendothelial or subepithelial deficits. Whereas 3 and 4, you have subendothelial predominant deficits. 5, you have subepithelial deficits, and class 6, you have 90% or more of the glomeruli which are sclerosed, and there is irreversible damage. This is the immunofluorescence microscopy, this is the electron microscopy picture, and this is your light microscopy picture for histopathology examination. This is class 1, minimal mesangial proliferative, focal lupus nephritis, diffuse lupus nephritis, and then finally you have your sclerosing cell. So in class 3, you have subendothelial deficit, subendothelial deficit. You have your subepithelial deficit. So next important system which is affected is the nervous system. So your heart, the CNS, and which are some of the vital organs are predominantly affected. That is why SLA is supposed to be a dreading disease, because it has a wide group of organs that are being targeted because of the widespread immune activation. Now, under the nervous system manifestation, you have the CNS vapors. So it can be a diffuse process or it can be vascular occlusive disease which requires anticoagulation. The diffuse process requires immunosuppression. Under diffuse process, we have features of cognitive dysfunction, seizures, psychosis, myelopathy, and under vascular occlusion as part of the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, there is accelerated atherosclerosis resulting in transient ischemic attacks, strokes, MI, etc. And Levin sac endocarditis, again it is because of the embolization. So this comes under vascular occlusion, though again it is a cardiac manifestation. I'm mentioning it under vascular occlusion because it is due to embolization. It is named Levin sac endocarditis, a non-thrombotic endocarditis that you should remember under SLA. So this is the type of endocarditis that you see in SLA because of embolization. So when there is vascular occlusion, you think of anticoagulation. When a diffuse CNS process results in neurodysfunction like seizures, psychosis, then you think of giving immunosuppression. Wherein both here and there, but remember anticoagulation in people with vascular occlusion. Now coming on to another important vital organ, which is the lung. Important manifestation is pleuritis. So mild cases can be treated with NSAIDs, most often requires glucocorticoid therapy. Life-threatening manifestation of SLV lung involvement will be intra-alveolar hemorrhage, diffuse alveolar damage. So again, when a patient is suspected to have intra-alveolar hemorrhage, aggressive immunosuppression is the treatment. So being an autoimmune disease, again the treatment modality is going to be suppressing the autoimmune response. That is by giving immunosuppressive agents. Now coming on to the cardiac manifestation. So the important cardiac manifestation is going to be pericarditis. Now pleuritis in the lung, we have pericarditis in the heart. It responds to anti-inflammatory therapy, glucocorticoid therapy. Endocarditis is known as Levin sac endocarditis. Myocarditis is also seen. So all the three layers of the heart are affected. The Levin sac endocarditis, you have vegetation here, which are then you have pericarditis associated with or without pericardial inflammation, pericardial effusion. Then myocarditis. Some of the ECG changes that we see in pericarditis, diffuse ST elevations. These are the typical SLE cells that you see. This is a Wieren's stain image. Okay. Now coming on to the hematological manifestations. Most often you have leukopenia, normocytic normosomic anemia because of the inflammatory process. Leukopenia, especially lymphopenia, thrombocytopenia can also occur, either because of the anti-erythrocyte or the antiplatelet antibodies. Now coming on to the GI manifestations, intestinal vasculitis, elevation of the liver enzymes, AST or ALT. Again, it is going to respond to glucocorticoid therapy. Ocular manifestations, it can cause optic neuritis, retinal vasculitis, and sometimes if there is an overlap syndrome, it can be associated with Pica syndrome. Long-term steroids, now importantly, ocular manifestations due to the treatment for SLE, long-term steroids can cause glaucoma as well as cataract. So this is important. While reviewing the patient on treatment, you should look out for these complications of long-term steroid therapy. Another thing that we discussed was avascular necrosis of the long bones. So this is to sum up the various manifestations of SLA. We have discussed a lot of manifestations. I hope you still remember these. You have cutaneous manifestations, acute, subacute, and chronic. Under chronic, you remember discoid leukocytosis. Under acute, remember the molar rash. If you remember clearly, there is an actress who is on whom there is memes were produced. The actress name was Malal, and she also had this typical rash over the cheek. So Mala rashes. Then you think of the next important will be the pigmentosa, the lupus nephritis. Then you think of muscle and joint, the musculoskeletal manifestations. Then heart, lungs, psoriasis, CNS manifestations. Apart from that, systemic manifestations like malaise, headache, fever will most often be present in these people. So the most common manifestations, systemic manifestations, musculoskeletal and cutaneous manifestations, hematological manifestations, especially leukopenia and homocytic non-Hodgkin's anemia, anemia or anemia due to a chronic disease. Neurological manifestations and cardiopulmonary manifestations rank next. Then renal manifestations are dreaded complications seen in up to 50% of the individuals. Gastrointestinal manifestations like intestinal vasculitis. Then thrombotic complications, either arterial or venous thrombosis because of the hypercoagulability associated with antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, which can cause vascular occlusion. Then ocular manifestations not very common. Think of Pickard syndrome. Think of complications, long-term complications of corticoids as well. Now, after completing or summing up the clinical manifestations and the diagnostic criteria, let's go into the laboratory investigations. Now, if you have a patient who you think of SLA, probably a woman of the childbearing age group who has a wide variety of organ manifestations, that's characteristic photosensitive rash with recurrent oral ulcers, alopecia, etc. Now, we go into the laboratory investigations. This is almost the summing up of what we have already covered. Now, the aim is to rule out the diagnosis or establish the diagnosis. And after starting treatment, during follow-up also we require regular lab investigations to look out for complications of therapy. Again, the lab investigations are going to help us in the follow-up of the patient to assess whether there is going to be a flare or the disease is still under remission. For screening, what you use are the complete blood counts. It is going to show sometimes, most often in normocytic anemia associated with lymphopenia, thrombocytopenia. Urine analysis, if there is lupus nephritis, albuminuria can be seen. Renal function test, again to see if there is no dysfunction. And then you subject the patient to testing for autoantibodies. The screening test will be AMA, which is positive in approximately 98%, that is more than 95% of the individuals. Therefore, it is a very apt, sensitive marker for screening. So what you have to use is immunofluorescence. So some of the private laboratories, they use ELISA. ELISA is not very sensitive. What you have to use is IA for immunofluorescence assay. The patient who is having AMA, less like a negative AMA report on multiple occasions, less likely to follow up with further investigations, less likely for it to be SLA. Anti-DSDNA antibody and anti-Smith antibodies are highly sensitive, highly specific for SLA. Anti-DSDNA antibody, in addition, serves the purpose of assessing the severity of the illness. Higher titers risk of flare, higher titers risk of underlying risk of nephritis or vasculitis. Antiphospholipid antibodies, as we already discussed, it is not specific for SLA, but it is associated with hypercoagulable state. Especially women who are pregnant, people with antiphospholipid syndrome, they have a high risk of fetal loss. This is the criteria for antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. That is, individuals with or without SLE, if they have one or more clotting episodes and repeated fetal loss, plus at least 2 positive tests. Among these 3 antibodies, at least 2 positive antiphospholipid antibodies should be positive over a span of more than 12 weeks. That is more than 3 months span. If they have at least 2 of these antibody positive with recurring fetal loss with one or more clotting episodes, then they are labeled to have antiphospholipid antibody syndrome with or without the presence of SLA. So it can occur as an isolated syndrome or with SLA. this antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. And these are the antibodies that you test already described: anticardiolipin, anti-beta-2 glycoprotein, and lupus anticoagulant. And the test is DRGVT, that is dilute Russell cyclovenom test. I will retain whatever I'm saying as much as possible. I'm just focusing on the important essential subheadings under SLE. SLE is actually a vast topic, covers a lot of important questions, covers a lot of important aspects. Again, anti-Rho and anti-La antibodies, or anti-SSA and anti-SSB antibodies respectively, have an increased risk of neonatal lupus, congenital heart block, Sika syndrome, and less likelihood of developing lupus nephritis. So in any woman of childbearing age group, you should check for anti-Rho, anti-La antibodies because of the higher risk of developing neonatal lupus. And they have a high susceptibility of developing subacute cutaneous lupus erythematosus. This one is the anti-DNA pattern. This is homogeneously staining. This is speckled pattern. This is an anti-centromere pattern, and this is a nuclear pattern. This homogeneous pattern is more commonly associated with anti-DSDMA. Spectral pattern is more commonly associated with anti-Rho, anti-La antibodies. The centromere pattern is associated with anti-centromere antibodies. Nuclear pattern is more associated with systemic sclerosis. This is the anti-DSDNA that you see, homogeneous pattern. Now tests for while following up. While following up to rule out flare as well as to rule out any complication of the therapy that they have initiated. So you check for the antibody C3, C4 complement levels, urine analysis. Now we'll go ahead with the management. So once you have diagnosed the disease, followed up with laboratory tests, now we look into the treatment. So treatment, I told you, once the patient develops lupus nephritis, especially class 3 and class 4, aggressive immunotherapy is required. So the aim of the treatment is to make sure that the patient is in remission and to sustain the remission. So if the disease manifestations are life-threatening or the disease manifestation is potentially reversible and it can prevent further complications, these are some of the guidelines, these are some of the criteria that guide our therapy. So if the patient does not have a life-threatening disease, for example, cutaneous manifestations or certain life-threatening conditions not involving the vital organs, then treatment using anti-malarial, analgesic, anti-inflammatory therapy would be sufficient. Especially NSAIDs like aspirin, anti-malarials like hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine can be used if there is less life-threatening involvement, such as involvement of the musculoskeletal system or the cutaneous manifestations. Hydroxychloroquine itself can have retinal toxicity, so that has to be watched out for after initiating therapy with hydroxychloroquine. Now, dehydroepiandrosterone. Since estrogen has a role in the pathogenesis, dehydroepiandrosterone can also be used in individuals who have non-life-threatening disease. This anti-LYS, belimumab, this is an monoclonal antibody that is used in non-life-threatening disease, especially in the more affluent countries. Low dose of systemic glucocorticoids can also be used. Why we do not go with an aggressive immunotherapy or an aggressive immunosuppressive therapy is because immunosuppression itself has a lot of adverse effects. Individuals who have lupus dermatitis can be treated with anti-malarial, hydroxychloroquine, use of sunscreen, because these cutaneous lesions are highly photosensitive. Use of topical glucocorticoids like in the form of ointments or emulsions. Use of tacrolimus, small low-dose systemic glucocorticoids, or even mycophenolate mofetil, which is another immunomodulating drug, which we will discuss in subsequent slides. This can be used in individuals who have lupus dermatitis. This is hydroxychloroquine. This is a topical glucocorticoid, NSAID, acetaminophen or paracetamol. This anti-BLYS, that is belimumab. These are some of the drugs that can be tried in individuals who have mild disease or non-life-threatening disease. These are conservative approaches. Whereas individuals with a life-threatening disease, especially lupus nephritis, the mainstay would be use of glucocorticoids. We start with either prednisolone or methylprednisolone. So what you do is, after starting them on 0.5 to 1 mg per kg of oral steroid or 500 to 1 gram of IV steroid, that is methylprednisolone is IV, oral will be prednisolone or prednisolone. Then you try to keep them maintain it for a period of 1 to 1.5 months in the same dose. Methylprednisolone usually that is known as pulse therapy. Give it for 3 days, 500 to 1 gram, followed by oral steroid at the dose of 0.5 mg to 1 mg per kg. Now doses are tapered and intermittent based on the disease remission, and try to taper it to a dose of 5 to 10 milligrams of prednisone per day because of the possible long-term complications of oral steroid. So this is a vial of methylprednisolone. This is known as pulse therapy. You pulse the patient 3 days of methylprednisolone followed by 1 mg per kg of oral prednisone. The problem with systemic steroid is going to be high susceptibility towards infection, both viral as well as fungal and other less common pathogenic agents that are going to target individuals with immunosuppression, with aseptic or avascular necrosis of the bone, Cushingoid changes with heart failure, that is edema, fragility of the skin, insomnia, that is known as steroid psychosis, menstrual irregularity, osteoporosis. All of these are some of the long-term complications of steroids. And these are the pictures which summarizes the long-term complications of steroids. Cushing's syndrome, that is overactivity of glucocorticoids. Most common cause of which is iatrogenic steroid administration, especially for individuals who have immunological disorders like SMA. What is known as Cushingoid habit is buffalo hump or Cushingoid facies, also known as the bone facies. This is the thin brittle skin. It shows a lot of striae, cutaneous striae, abdominal obesity, thin extremities, easy bruising, psychosis, steroid psychosis, cardiovascular manifestations like congestive heart failure, edema, hypertension, osteoporosis, avascular necrosis of the femur or the long bone, endocrine manifestations like diabetes, immunological manifestations, lymphocytopenia, ophthalmic manifestations like glaucoma, cataract, and growth retardation if it is used in a younger individual. These are some of the complications of long-term steroids. Again, these are nephritis. You have other immunosuppressive agents also. These are some of the cytotoxic agents which have more side effects, but have to be used in individuals who have steroid unresponsive latest nephritis. Cyclophosphamide or MMF, also known as mycophenolate mofetil. Cyclophosphamide is an alkylating agent. Mycophenolate mofetil is a relatively lymphocyte-specific inhibitor of inosine monophosphatase. Basically, it inhibits the purine synthesis. Azathioprine, which is an anti-metabolite. So basically, you have two arms. Either you put the patient on MMF, which has lesser side effects, cyclophosphamide, both of which are teratogenic. So cyclophosphamide is one of the most popular drugs that are used along with high-dose steroids. They have two regimens, a low-dose regimen and a high-dose regimen. That is 500 milligrams of intravenous cyclophosphamide once every 2 weeks, total of 6 doses, followed by MMF or azathioprine. Whereas a high-dose regimen is based on meter square body surface area, 500 to 1000 milligrams, given monthly, once a month for 6 months, followed by azathioprine or mycophenolate mofetil. These two regimens. One, what you do is you give 500 milligrams IV once every 2 weeks for 6 doses, followed by azathioprine or mycophenolate mofetil, whereas the high-dose regimen you use it once a month, which is 500 to 1000 milligrams per meter square of body surface area, which you use for a period of 6 months, once a month for 6 months, again followed by azathioprine or MMF. The advantage of low-dose regimen is it has lesser toxicity, whereas high-dose regimen has higher remission rates. Now, maintenance therapy, azathioprine or mycophenolate. This is specifically for lupus nephritis. Azathioprine or mycophenolate mofetil. Mycophenolate mofetil is given as a dose of 1.5 to 2 grams. Azathioprine is 1 to 2.5 milligrams per kg per day. Azathioprine is safer compared to cyclophosphamide. The disadvantage of all of these immunosuppressive or cytotoxic agents is bone marrow suppression. So what happens after treatment with cyclophosphamide or mycophenolate mofetil? We start to see the responses within a period of 1 month. As glucocorticoids, they have an early onset response. Individuals who have multiple flares of lupus nephritis are more likely to develop end-stage renal disease. Other some possible drugs, leflunomide is a newer drug which is a pyrimidine antagonist. Whereas mycophenolate mofetil was a purine antagonist or an inhibitor of the purine synthesis. Cyclosporine tacrolimus, which are going to affect the interleukin function as well as T lymphocyte function. This is some of the other drugs that can be used. Anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody, also known as rituximab, delimumab, which is also advocated for cutaneous lupus or lupus dermatitis. This can also be used. Then once you start treating the patient, you employ what is known as a SLEDAI score. That is a disease activity index, SLE disease activity index, which shows an indication of the severity of the disease. So at baseline, you check SLEDAI score or the SLEDAI score. Then at every hospital visit subsequently, look at the SLEDAI score to see if the patient is going into remission or if the patient is not improving or is worsening. And once the score, the patient is in remission, and during one clinical visit, if the score is more than 3, that is, if the difference in the score or the score jumps up more than 3, that shows that the disease is becoming active. So these are various components of the SLEDAI score. Now, based on this, we assess it as into none, mild, moderate, or severe. These are the factors, presence of seizures, psychosis, visual disturbances, all of these. You give some points and then you calculate the entire score. So the score jumps to more than 3 points and it shows that the disease is becoming more active. You do not need to know the entire tabular column by heart, just remember SLEDAI score or SLEDAI score is used to quantitate the disease activity. So patients having more than 3 points change shows that a flare is there. A mild to moderate flare is more than 3. If it jumps more than 12 points, that shows that there is a severe flare, most often because of drug non-compliance or because of inadequate treatment or because of resistance to the treatment. Now, these are some of the criteria that shows that there is a severe flare. You do not need to know much in depth of this tabular column. It's more of a postgraduate learning. Just have to remember the SLEDAI score. All of this I would skip. Now I'll come just briefly touch upon what is drug-induced lupus. So certain drugs can cause a lupus-like manifestation. So this is associated with antihistamine antibody, positive AMA, and they develop the rash, arthralgia, myalgia, typically seen in lupus. Rarely renal involvement and rarely brain involvement is seen. It is not usually associated with anti-DLPMA antibody that is useful to differentiate it from SLE. And these are the drugs that can cause lupus-like features. So this drug-induced lupus can be because of antiarrhythmics, antihypertensive agents like hydrolizine, ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, propylthiouracil, antipsychotics like lithium, chlorpromazine, anticonvulsants like carbamazepine, phenytoin, antibiotics like isoniazid, nitrofurantoin, anti-rheumatoid drugs like sulfasalazine, diuretics like hydrochlorothiazide, hypolipidemia drugs like statins, interferons and TNF inhibitors can all cause lupus-like reaction. Once you withdraw the drug, the symptoms on its own disappear. So that is another diagnostic tool to differentiate it from SLE. Some of the experimental therapies, again, you will not know too much in detail about these. In severe refractory SLE, in rarest of rare cases, you can try transplantation of hematopoietic stem cells. Then I will skip this. So poorer prognosis is associated with high serum creatinine levels. So lupus nephritis is going to be associated with poor prognosis. Hypertension, nephrotic syndrome, anemia, hyperalbuminemia is all going to be associated with poor prognosis. Again, presence of associated with male gender, ethnicity, antiphospholipid antibodies, hypercomplementemia, low socioeconomic status, all are going to be associated with poorer prognosis. Again, there is a high risk of graft rejection compared to individuals with end-stage renal disease due to other causes, most often because of diabetes or hypertension, when compared to individuals with SLE. The primary cause of death and disability is going to be nephritis and infection. So that's all for today's class. Thank you all for your patient listening. I hope you've picked up some of the important points from this discussion. It is an extensive topic. I've tried to cover as much as possible. Just remember the basic pathogenesis. Remember, it is an autoimmune disorder which is caused by an abnormal immune response due to some genetic susceptible factors as well as environmental factors that is going to cause widespread inflammatory response resulting in varied organ damages. And remember the important clinical manifestations. Remember the SLIC6 criteria. Remember certain diagnostic tools. Remember the autoantibody, the tablet column. Then the treatment aspect, how we give certain immunosuppressive agents, glucocorticoids being the mainstay. Then lupus nephritis by use cyclophosphamide, either a low dose or a high dose regimen, followed by a maintenance therapy consisting of azathioprine or mycophenolate mofetil. Then try to remember a few of the newer therapies if possible, and drug-induced or drug-sensitive lupus. Thank you all for your patient listening. Any doubts, kindly contact me via your class monitor or directly contact me on the email ID aparnasudhakar1@gmail.com. APARNNASUDHAKAR1@gmail.com. Thank you all for your patient listening. Have a great day.